So this week I learned that there was a time when the city of Paris ate all of its zoo animals. So today, unicorn stew is being subbed out for kangaroo stew. Okay, so here's the background. In 1870, Paris was under siege from the German army during the Prussian War. They were running very low on food, but one chef didn't get that memo and decided to continue to plan a very opulent Christmas dinner for his hotel restaurant. However, given that Parisians had already eaten 65,000 horses, a load of cats, dogs, and even rats to save off starvation, he decided to cook a meal using all of the zoo animals. So the Parisian zoo at the time was in a really desperate financial situation with the siege and was struggling to feed its animals. They clearly felt that instead of feeding their animals to other people was a very good alternative. Maybe that's what they thought they would have wanted, I don't know. But anyway, the zoo decided to sell their animals, and the head chef of the Prussian restaurant decided to buy them all up and cook an exotic Christmas banquet for their clientele. I was a bit lost trying to work out where to start with this one, because the menu includes everything from wolf to elephant. And even if it were legal, I don't think I've got it in me to eat Dumbo. Sadly, the restaurant didn't save the recipe for kangaroo stew, so I'm just going to approach this like a classic bœuf bourguignon. I've probably mangled that pronunciation. Starting with some bacon. Given that the siege saw Parisians eating dogs, cats, horses, rats, and even goldfish, it does feel like slightly cheating. I don't think they would probably just had bacon lardons lying around. So I'm gonna fry off the bacon lardons. So after 4 months of the siege, Paris's zoo couldn't feed their zoo animals anymore. So they decided to sell the animals for food for the few restaurants still open in the city. The meal at the Prussian restaurant which served this kangaroo stew recipe, it included stuffed donkey head, roasted camel, kangaroo stew, bear chops with pepper sauce, wolf haunch and deer sauce, and an antelope terrine. The restaurant even used up the 2 elephants from the Paris zoo. And as it turns out, people were willing to pay a lot for their trunks. There was one English politician who was living in Paris at the time of the siege, and he managed to experience the feast at the Prussian restaurant. He described eating a slice of elephant trunk as tough, rough, and greasy, and something not to be recommended when there's mutton or beef as an alternative. However, by the time the banquet got to pudding, it was a little bit more traditional. They had a rice pudding with jam and Gruyere cheese. So then we've got some brown on our bacon, and then we turn to our kangaroo meat. I'm gonna fry this a little bit. So one journalist living in Paris reported in an English newspaper about his experiences living through the siege. At the higher end of food costs, terrines of chicken were costing 16 francs, which from what I can work out is about the equivalent of £65 today. Turkeys were selling at 60 francs, equivalent of £230 today, and vegetables like cauliflower and cabbage would set you back about £12 a piece. This really smells like venison. A lot of water in this kangaroo. Then at the lower end of the scale, you could buy horse meat, cats, dogs, rats. One writer I was reading picked up on some interesting dietary observations from the siege, namely that as they were all turned to eat dogs, apparently there were preferences for certain breed, like poodles became very popular to eat. Horse meat became really popular, and they would also use horse blood to make an equine equivalent of black pudding. What I found really interesting though, is that rats cost 1 franc. It went up to 1 franc and 50 cents if it was fat from the drain. Now what I'm going to do is load up my browned kangaroo meat into a pan. I'm going to dust it with a little bit of flour to help my stew thicken ultimately. Oh, it feels like a symphony of death. That's going to sit in the oven for 10 minutes just to toast up. So I'm going to soften up some shallots and some baby carrots. Just going to try and get some colour on these. The same reporter who was comparing the food prices, he also recalled having a dinner with a fellow journalist at a restaurant and ended up eating a large amount of mouflon, which is apparently a wild species of sheep. Reflecting on the meal, he said he didn't think he'd be moving to its native Corsica anytime soon. The same journalist also mentioned that one day he ate at a restaurant and ate a sauté of rat, but the restaurateur was so embarrassed about it he tried to pass it off as wild game. Just going to add in some tomato paste. There were actually a few animals that didn't get eaten. A couple of bay leaves. They were lions, tigers, hippos and monkeys. Going to deglaze. Pan wasn't hot enough. The lions, tigers and hippo probably weren't eaten because they were just too fierce. But there's a theory that the monkeys weren't eaten because they were considered to be too human, and I think probably a bit too close to the bone, no pun intended. It is also worth remembering that behind this story of wealthy Parisians eating their zoo animals, there was a city that was trying to cope with starvation. Away from expensive restaurants whose clientele could afford to eat elephant consomme, everyday Parisians were even more stretched to stave off starvation. There was an American doctor who was trapped in Paris during the siege, and he wrote about a butcher's shop window that he saw in the city. Going to add in beef stock. He described several neatly dressed cats and dogs hanging by the neck in the butcher shop window. He described the butcher's wife trying to convince some old lady to try and buy some meat. And he also describes a little girl staring at a tray of a dozen stretched out rats. An English journalist living in Paris at the time also mentions that as well as eating rat salami, he'd seen people eating begonias to try and stave off starvation. Add the bacon back in. The novelist Victor Hugo describes eating stag, bear and antelope during that siege. About a month after Christmas, the Germans prevailed in the siege and they started to let food trains come through. But the siege had already left its mark on the city. In February, the American doctor wrote that it had been over a month since he'd seen an alive dog walking the streets. The siege was bad for dogs. To our stew, we're going to add back in our kangaroo. Lid on. Okay, see you in 1 to 3 hours later. So I present to you kangaroo stew. Let's just give it a little... Okay, so there's some nice tender bits on the kangaroo. I've never tried kangaroo before. When I was prepping the kangaroo, it smelled a little bit like a venison or a beef to me. Cheers. That is almost just a carbon copy of venison. There's a tiny little background bit of almost like lamb flavour in there for me, but it's very much beef venison level. Although I can break this up with a fork, it's still a bit dry. It's soft, but it's not melt in your mouth tender. There is absolutely no question that given the choice between this and rat, cat or dog, I would rather go for this. But that also presupposes that I've got the element of choice, which for many Parisians, they didn't. If you're wealthy enough to have the choice between French poodle and elephant consomme, who knows, in a starvation situation, maybe you'll make an interesting call yourself. When I first heard about this story, about how the Parisian upper classes ate all the zoo animals, it sounds a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? There's an argument to be said, of course, that it was Christmas time and they were probably just trying to conjure up some festive cheer to try and lift their spirits. That being said, it's probably a lot easier to have your spirits lifted at Christmas if you're not forced to pay the extra 50 cents for a fat rat. Hey, thank you for watching. So before I store it away for tomorrow, I'll just say thank you very much for watching. Please let me know in the comments if there's something else you'd like to see me recreate. Hope to see you again soon.